Hello, this is a video response to TheIrishPolack, and he asked 3 questions to Theists, and I would like to give a response to that. I like the 3 questions, and I like some of the guys that he asked specifically, kind of listened to Telemantros and Veritas 48 in particular. So I'm curious about their responses, but since this is a very personal response, I thought I would answer as well. The first question he asked a theist was, what is your God's primary way of communicating with you? I think before I answer this question, I need to define who my God is, at least a little bit. I am a Christian, and therefore I believe in Yahweh or Jehovah, depending on how you would pronounce the name, the God as defined in the Old and the New Testaments of the Bible. And so I believe God's primary way of communicating with me is through the Bible. And what I mean by that is I believe that the Bible has specific meaning, just like any other book, that there was an original author to the text, and that author God used to have a specific meaning to that specific people group. And then that meaning can be generalized at times from certain texts. There are specific principles that might be generalized throughout time. And therefore, when we study those texts, we can find out what the original author intended to say. And then we can also find out what we as people are supposed to take from that, how that might apply to our lives. Now, I believe that in the application process, that's really where more of the personal type of thing happens, where personal communication with God takes place, or we are supposed to get personal messages. It's kind of difficult for me. I think that sometimes people can receive direct messages from God in kind of supernatural ways, but I really believe the primary way that God speaks to us is through the truth found in His Word. But how we apply that to our lives then is going to be the way that we would, and I personally find God's communicating to me on a more personal level. I want to give you an example of that. As I thought about the question, I was thinking about the verse from Ephesians 5:25 that says, "Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church, and He gave Himself up for her." And so this is a verse that I can find the meaning. The Apostle Paul here is talking to the Ephesian church, and he's talking to husbands. And so therefore, this is not one of the really hard gap. Okay, I'm guessing that husbands back in that day may have thought a little bit different about their wives. In fact, they may not even love their wives like we in our kind of a modern setting might think we should. But he's commanding them to love their wives as Christ loved the church and gave Himself up for her. So we see that Jesus sacrificed Himself for certain people. And so there's an analogy being made here. Husbands, you should sacrifice yourself for your wife. So we can find that's a large principle. Anybody can grasp that if you read that text and see, okay, that's what the Apostle Paul meant to write, and therefore I as a Christian believe that that's what God meant us to get. But how does that apply to my life specifically? As a married man, how is it that I would be, supposed to sacrifice myself? Am I supposed to go get killed for my wife, or is there some other meaning for that? And I think it would look something like this for me. I'm a NASCAR fan, and so on a Sunday afternoon, my wife's not a huge NASCAR fan. She knows who the people are because, hey, I watch NASCAR. But it would be something like where I really want to watch this NASCAR race, and it's a nice Sunday afternoon, and my wife wants to go take a walk. And I might sacrifice my desires then. God might call me to sacrifice my desires. And that's something that I think in my spirit, I might be reminded of that verse, reminded of this meaning, and say, okay, I should go sacrifice my desires to be with my wife, to love her as Christ loved the church. That would be a specific application, not the only application of that verse, but one where it's kind of practical for my life, how that works out. God would give me this message from the Scriptures, and then say, how does that work out? So that's how God communicates with me primarily. I mean, I do pray, but I think that the inner intuitions that I get are really in line with what I've already learned from Scripture. The second question then is, what is your primary focus on living as a representative of your God? And I just want to give a little autobiographical stuff here. I think first of all, which of course this whole video should be autobiographical, but first of all, in my life, I grew up in a very religious Christian home. My dad was a pastor, and I myself am a pastor. And so I grew up with the intent to try to please God, to try to do the best that I could, to try to be perfect. I could I knew a lot about the Bible, knew a lot about some of the Christian doctrines, and I said, okay, I want to please God as best as I can. And I used to really then try hard to just do all the laws perfectly, and I felt guilty a lot of times because of that. I had a lot of guilt in my life because I knew I wasn't doing it all right. I had issues in my life, or sin problems, or I thought about sex, or whatever it was. I had those kinds of things in my life, and I felt guilty all the time. And it, in my early 20s, it caused me a lot of problems. I became even suicidal over that. And so what happened was, I think that I finally began to learn that I don't believe that's the true message of the Bible, that God wants us to try really hard. As a matter of fact, I think it's exactly the opposite. He said you can't do it on your own. And so I've learned that the primary focus of my life should not be to try to do the right thing to please God, but rather simply to try to spend time with God, letting Him show me His love first. He came to love me first. The more time I spend with Him, the more I become like Him. And since I think God is the greatest good, and all the good characteristics of God, I then develop those characteristics. I become more Christ-like. My life verse is Philippians 1:21, which says, "For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And that's, again, the Apostle Paul there saying, for him, if he's living, it's going to be all about Christ, and we're becoming more like Christ. And I find when I spend time with God, in His Word, in prayer, with other Christians, that sort of thing, fellowshipping, trying to get close to Him, I, in fact, become a better man. Another verse that I really like is Romans 12:1 and 2. In view of the mercy of God, dear brothers, offer your bodies as living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to the Lord. This is your spiritual act of worship. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may be able to tell what the will of God, His good, perfect, and pleasing will. The reason I quote that verse is I use it a lot in my own ministry. I say the point really isn't go out and make yourself better. The point is understand what God has done for you and view the mercy of God, and then from that point on, offer yourself as a response to the love of God. Then you offer yourselves back to Him, and then you can be transformed. Then you're not going to be conformed. Why? Because He renews your mind from the inside out. And so I think that's where I'm at right now. My primary focus is to really offer myself to God, to be there in His presence, to be changed. And the final question is, what is it you ask God the most for? And again, I suppose in the past it was things like safety and purpose and for myself and my family, and I still ask God for those things. More recently, I think it's probably been a lot about people that I've been ministering to who are hurting, that God might help change their hearts, change their lives. I see a lot of people that run into addictions, or just are really hurting, broken families, kids that are hurting. And so I spend a lot of time praying for them, but probably more than anything right now, kind of going back to my last point, nowadays I'm just trying to spend more time in God's presence and asking Him for more of Himself. And I know that sounds really kind of esoteric, and if you come from one perspective, an atheistic perspective, perhaps it sounds like almost meaninglessness, asking God for more of Himself. But what I mean by that is that I think if God is as I believe, God is the ground of everything that exists, and all good things come from God. And the more I get of Him, I actually get more pleasure. John Piper, a favorite pastor of mine, wrote a book called Desiring God, and he claims to be a Christian hedonist. And he says, I think I want the most pleasure, but not understanding that pleasure doesn't come from this world, but rather the pleasure comes ultimately from spending the most time with God. And that's really what I'm wanting more of these days, is just to be changed and transformed by being in His presence. And I have found then that the rest of the life takes on more significance. It's not that I enjoy life less, I enjoy it more. So time with my family, I've got 5 kids, other pleasures, even sexual pleasure, has gone from being kind of perverse to being something I really enjoy with my wife. Our friendships are richer, they're deeper. Things have more significance. When I go out in the nature, I enjoy it, and I've even found my intellectual life to be really encouraged by knowing that this earth has order and that there's something behind it. And so as I focus more time praying for God to give me Himself, I also then begin to see the significance of other people, other things. And I think in an objective social standard, I can say that I could look at my life 10 years ago, and 15 years ago, and say, here's a purposeless, meaningless kind of guy trying to live a very legalistic type of life, and God has taken me from that, and now I think I'm a better person in an objective standard. If you were to look at a better husband, a better father, just a better man, a better worker, a more responsible person. And so for me, I want to continue to grow in who God is and know Him better. And that's one of my primary goals then. Thanks. I hope this video was enjoyable.